psycho granny. When I was 8, my sister and I had one of the most terrifying nights of our lives. She was 12 at the time, and our brother wasn't born yet, so it must have been before then. Our parents were out for their anniversary dinner and wouldn't be back until midnight, leaving my sister in charge of babysitting me. She was responsible and capable, and I felt safe with her. What I didn't know at the time, and wouldn't learn until years later, was that my parents had warned her about our grandma, my dad's mom. They told her grandma was manic depressive, what people used to call bipolar, and angry with my dad for enforcing some kind of boundary. They specifically instructed my sister not to let her in if she showed up, and not to even respond to her. Of course, none of this was shared with me. How could you explain something like that to an 8-year-old? A couple of hours into the evening, we heard a knock on the door. My sister immediately hushed me and put a finger to her lips. "Robbie, I know you're in there. Robbie, come open the door." I recognized the voice immediately. It was Grandma, but something about it sounded off. My sister grabbed me and moved us to the hallway, out of sight from the windows. Grandma kept pounding on the door, yelling for my dad to let her in. Then everything went quiet. I started to relax, thinking it was over, but it wasn't. Suddenly, there was an ear-splitting bang as Grandma began slamming on a bedroom window. She wasn't just yelling anymore. She was screaming. Her voice twisted with anger. She sounded less like a person and more like a demon. I'd never heard such fury, before or since. She went from window to window, pounding and howling like a wild animal. If she hadn't been so old, I'm convinced she would have broken a window with the sheer force of her fists. Then, silence again. But this time, I didn't relax. My sister and I sat in the hallway, shaking, too scared to even whisper. After a long pause, her tone suddenly changed. Her voice was sickly sweet, like a doting grandmother offering cookies. "Come on, kiddos, open the door. I have candy for you," she cooed. Grandma always had candy. She was diabetic and in complete denial, so she had a stash with her at all times. For a split second, her sugary tone almost convinced me to trust her. But my sister held me tight and didn't let me move. She was wise beyond her years and knew better. Eventually, the house fell silent. No yelling, no pounding, just silence. My sister decided it was time for bed. I was reluctant, but too scared to argue. My bedroom faced the backyard, which had a pool and a tall wall beyond it. Past the wall was a wide-open field with old railroad tracks running through it. I was used to hearing coyotes and other animals outside at night, so I wasn't usually scared. But as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of scratching. It wasn't soft or subtle. It was loud and deliberate, like someone dragging their nails down my window. Frozen in terror, I glanced at the window. In the moonlight, I could make out her silhouette. My grandmother was standing there, scratching at the glass, staring into my room. My heart raced, and every hair on my body stood on end. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just lay there, paralyzed, until the scratching finally stopped. The next morning, my sister told our parents everything. I couldn't even stay in the room while they discussed it. A few weeks later, Grandma passed away. She died from an E. coli infection while on the toilet, much like Elvis. At her viewing, she wore one of her signature flowy blouses, and a gust of wind lifted it slightly. One of my cousins screamed, "She's alive!" and ran out of the room. After the funeral, I told my parents I was glad she was gone. According to my mom, I said, "Grandma really stressed me out." She later confided that no child my age should have ever felt that way about a grandparent. Oh, Mom, she did more than stress me out. That night, she terrified me in a way no horror movie or campfire story ever could. Both of my parents are gone now, and I wish I had told them how deeply that night affected me. But I trust my sister told them everything they needed to know. Now, as a parent myself, I have a 4-year-old daughter. Seeing her with my wife's parents, kind, loving grandparents who dote on her brings me to tears. Whether she's riding a horse or chasing chickens on their farm, she's getting the kind of grandparent experience I could only dream of. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be talking to my therapist about this. A true EMS horror story. I worked as a dispatcher for a small ambulance station near a fairly large city in the middle of the US. I'm keeping details vague since this is a true story. Today, I want to share one of the most surreal and unsettling experiences I encountered on the job. We had a regular patient whom I'll call Susan. She was a dialysis patient, and one of our services was transporting seriously ill or disabled individuals to and from their dialysis appointments. Susan, who was in her late 70s, lived with her son David, a man in his late 40s. For years, like clockwork, we transported Susan to her dialysis treatments 3 times a week. Everyone at the station knew Susan and David, either from interacting with them in person or through frequent phone calls about her appointments. As a result, we were familiar with her health status and often shared updates among the crew. One day, Susan wasn't feeling well, but insisted on attending her dialysis session. During her treatment, she lost consciousness and was rushed to the hospital by our crew. When her next dialysis appointment came around, we called the hospital to check if she had been discharged. The staff told us she was still admitted and receiving treatment in the hospital. At the following appointment, we called again and were told she'd been discharged the previous day. While we found it odd that Susan hadn't contacted us, she always relied on us for transportation. We assumed everything was fine and called David to confirm her plans. David informed us that Susan wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be going to dialysis that day. He mentioned he might take her back to the hospital if her condition worsened. We told him to call us if he needed help and canceled her trip for the day. However, we never received a follow-up call. For the next few appointments, the same pattern repeated. We called David. He told us Susan was either too sick or back in the hospital, and we canceled her trips. It seemed strange, especially since we hadn't been called to transport her to the hospital. Things escalated when we called David for yet another appointment and got no answer. After multiple attempts, we decided to send a crew to her home to check if she was ready for dialysis. When the crew arrived, they knocked on the door, but initially got no response. After knocking again, David answered, cigarette in hand, looking surprised. The crew explained they were there to pick up Susan. David replied that she was still in the hospital and apologized for forgetting to call. The crew wished him well and left, but something about the interaction didn't sit right. The crew radioed dispatch, expressing their concerns, and requested that we confirm with the hospital whether Susan was truly admitted. When we contacted the hospital, they had no record of Susan being there since her last visit weeks earlier. Alarmed, we contacted local authorities to request a welfare check at Susan's home. We didn't hear anything further that day. Not from the police, David, or anyone else. The next morning, the first call I took at work was from the sheriff's department. "This is Sheriff Jack," the caller began. "I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you requested yesterday." His tone was serious, and my stomach sank as he continued. The officers had arrived at the home and spoken with David, who insisted that Susan wasn't feeling well, but was home from the hospital. When they asked to check on her, David reluctantly let them inside. What they found was horrifying. Susan's lifeless body was sitting on the couch, wrapped in blankets, as though she were simply watching TV. The officers estimated she had been dead for about 2 weeks. David had been living with her body the entire time, changing her clothes and acting as though she were still alive. David's actions were deeply disturbing, but they also reflected profound grief and mental illness. Strangely, those around Susan remarked that David had never been particularly attentive to her needs while she was alive. No further updates came from the police. There was no news coverage, and the story faded into obscurity. It's chilling to think about the things that happen in quiet neighborhoods. Things we might never hear about. Crazy, right? How my friend and I were nearly kidnapped. In 2019, my friend and I, both 13 at the time, attended a summer camp that focused on public speaking. One of the camp activities involved going into town with counselors to survey people about various topics. On the final day, our last stop was a Walmart. We talked to several people, but one encounter stuck out. An older man, who seemed polite at first, answered our questions. Once finished, he started asking us personal questions, our names, where we lived, and details about our interests. At that age, we were naive and didn't understand the importance of stranger danger. We answered his questions without hesitation. A few days later, a Facebook account named ed_Patzes sent us friend requests. The account spammed likes on our old posts, left comments with rose and fire emojis, and called us things like hot and sexy. It quickly escalated when we started receiving explicit photos from the account. Horrified, we blocked it. A few days later, the account disappeared entirely, and we assumed that was the end of it. It wasn't. When school started in August, we had almost forgotten about the incident, but the same name, Ed Patzes, appeared again, sending friend requests to both of us. This time, the account commented on baby pictures, saying things like, "You look so cute in that dress," and "Your baby blonde hair is gorgeous." This was far beyond creepy. We told our parents, who advised us to set our profiles to private. The police unfortunately dismissed it, suggesting we delete our accounts. Of course, as teenagers, we didn't want to give up social media. Over the next few years, the harassment continued. New accounts with variations of the same name would appear, sending friend requests and spam messages. By 2022, the situation escalated. The stalker started creating fake profiles using the names and pictures of our friends. Thinking these were legitimate accounts, we often accepted them. Once accepted, the accounts would start spamming explicit photos and lewd comments. This happened so often that we stopped accepting friend requests altogether, even from people we knew. By mid-2022, the fake accounts seemed to stop, and we thought it was finally over. We were wrong. In the summer of 2022, I let my guard down. A friend request came in that looked legitimate. A schoolmate's name, real photos, and mutual friends. Against my better judgment, I accepted it. My friend, still wary, didn't. For weeks, the account acted normal, liking posts here and there, occasionally reacting to a story. It wasn't until strange things started happening that I connected the dots. One night, I posted a picture of myself and a friend at a park. Within minutes, a white truck pulled into the parking lot and parked eerily close to my car. The truck's headlights stayed on, pointed directly at us as we sat on the swings. Feeling uneasy, we decided to walk laps around the park instead of heading to the car, afraid the driver might try something. After an hour, the truck finally left. Incidents like this started happening more frequently, but I dismissed them as coincidences. It wasn't until I saw the driver, a man who looked just like the one from Walmart in 2019, that I realized I was being stalked. By 2023, I had become hyper-vigilant. On the last night of that year's summer camp, I was driving a group of younger campers home. My phone, nearly unusable due to storage issues, couldn't call or text anyone. We took a detour through a scenic backroad neighborhood at the kids' request. That's when it happened. A white truck appeared behind us, flashing its brights and honking aggressively. The driver swerved, trying to bump my car off the road. Panicking, I screamed at the kids to sit down, buckle up, and roll up the windows. I sped through the narrow streets, narrowly avoiding a deep drainage ditch. At one point, the truck came close to ramming my car, but I managed to swerve onto a resident's yard and escape. After a tense chase, I lost the truck and stopped at a gas station to let the kids calm down. They thought it was an adrenaline-filled adventure, but I was terrified. I noticed the same truck parked near my high school earlier that day, and now it had followed me for nearly 25 minutes. When I finally got home, I called my best friend Anne. She answered, sobbing. Anne had also been chased that night. She explained that while stopping at a closed gas station to calm her crying baby, a white truck pulled in and parked horizontally in front of her car, blocking her in. Panicking, she drove over a curb to escape. The truck pursued her, trying to force her off the road. She only managed to escape because her brothers were outside her house when she arrived, scaring the stalker away. The white truck incidents didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, Sightings of the truck and reports of similar encounters flooded social media. Eventually, the man in the white truck and an accomplice in a red car were caught on video trying to kidnap a 7-year-old from their porch. This footage led to their arrest in a neighboring town. It turned out they had been stalking multiple people in our area for years. Both my friend and I filed reports with the police after their identities were confirmed. Thankfully, we've not seen or heard from them since their arrest. Looking back, it's terrifying how close we came to real danger, but we're grateful it's finally over. I was hiding from your mom. One of the creepiest stories I know personally comes from my best friend, David. It happened when he was home babysitting a friend's kid. The kid, named Junior, was about 4 or 5 years old. Junior's dad worked as a courier and often had late-night deliveries. By this point, David was a teenager, so staying home without an adult wasn't a big deal. It's worth noting that Junior's dad was a very paranoid man who believed in a lot of fear-mongering, so he had cameras installed all over the house. This took place around 2014. One evening, David was in his bedroom, minding his own business, when he decided to check the den where all the security camera monitors were located. Strangely, the den was locked. David knocked on the door, and Junior opened it. "Why did you lock the door?" David asked. "Because of the lady," Junior replied. "What lady?" David asked, confused. "Your mom. I saw her in the kitchen." The layout of the house had the living room directly connected to the kitchen. From the kitchen's entryway, you could see the door leading to the screened-in sitting area outside. Junior claimed that David's mother had been standing right there, in the doorway. This was deeply unsettling, because David's mother had passed away about 8 months prior. The comment sent a chill down his spine, but David dismissed it as Junior's overactive imagination. Still, he decided to check it out, just to reassure the boy. To be cautious, David grabbed a kitchen knife before heading to investigate. David and Junior walked down the hallway to the kitchen. The door to the screened area was open, which wasn't unusual. It was a hot summer night, and the house retained a lot of heat. David stepped out onto the screened sitting area and looked around. To his left, down the ramp his mother used to use, there was nothing. To his right, across the length of the yard, nothing. But Junior was adamant. "I saw your mom. She was here," he insisted. David couldn't calm him down. Normally, kids feel better after you check for them, but Junior remained certain of what he saw. To settle things, David suggested they check the cameras. "Everything's recorded," he said. "We'll look at the footage and see if anyone was there." David sifted through the footage, searching for the moment Junior claimed to have seen his mother. At first, nothing showed up, but then, to David's shock, the cameras captured an old woman entering the backyard through the front gate. She appeared to be in her mid-60s, carrying a cloth grocery bag. She confidently walked into the backyard, up the ramp, and stood in the screened sitting area for a few moments before opening the kitchen door and stepping inside. She stayed there for at least 10 minutes. Junior had spotted her during this time and immediately went to alert David. The most chilling part? The camera showed the woman leaving just as David and Junior came to investigate. When David looked left down the ramp, she had already wrapped around the yard, taking the long way out. When he looked right, she was just a second away from being out of view. It was a near miss. The footage showed her wandering into the kitchen and standing there doing who knows what before leaving. Nothing was stolen, and no one was harmed. Still, it was an incredibly unnerving experience. The rest of the night passed without incident, though David admitted later that he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Personally, I would have called the police immediately, but David didn't. He suspected his father might have had some unregistered guns in the house, locked away, but still enough to make involving the authorities risky. His dad would have been furious if the police had shown up. Sometime later, whether days or weeks, I'm not sure, David found out the truth. Apparently, the old woman suffered from dementia and had wandered into the house by sheer coincidence during an episode. A family member or staff worker explained the situation to him, offering some closure. Still, it's one of the creepiest stories I've ever heard. My friend saved my life from a creature. This happened about 3 years ago when I was 17 and my friend was 16. One night, we were having a bonfire behind my barn. It was the perfect night. No wind, hoodie weather, and a massive fire lighting up the surrounding area. We were messing around, enjoying ourselves, when we decided to check out my pond, which was about 500 feet away. Part of the pond was faintly illuminated by the fire, and it looked cool from a distance. As we walked, we joked about creepy stuff, like skinwalkers or humanoid creatures lurking in the woods. For years, I'd always told myself I wanted to see something strange. I even wanted something supernatural or unexplainable to happen, just so I could pull out my phone and capture it. My friend, on the other hand, hated when I talked like that. It made him tense, which I thought was hilarious, especially since we were smack in the middle of farmland, surrounded by woods, the perfect creepy setting. When we got to the pond, we were joking around when both of us noticed something shiny about 20 feet to our right. It stood out immediately because I'd just mowed that area a few hours earlier, and there shouldn't have been anything there except 2 full-grown trees. My friend asked, "Hey, where'd that giant rock come from?" I looked closer and immediately felt uneasy. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a tree stump. Nothing should have been there. We started walking toward it, curiosity taking over, and as we got closer, I kept saying, "What the hell is that?" My friend started to panic, saying, "What the hell is that?" in a way that made my stomach drop. By the time we were about 5 feet away, I realized this wasn't an object. It was something alive. It was crouched down, almost in a fetal position. I could make out a neck, a torso, and wrinkled grayish skin with little white hairs. It was about 3 feet long and maybe 2 feet high. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was looking at. I said one last time, "What is this thing?" That's when my friend screamed in pure terror, grabbed me by the arm, and yanked me backward. His reaction jolted me into action, and we both took off running as fast as we could back to my house, glancing over our shoulders the whole way to make sure it wasn't following us. Once we got inside, we told my mom what had happened. Predictably, she just said, "Oh yeah?" Like she didn't believe a word of it. But I was determined to prove it, so I grabbed a flashlight, and we jumped into my car. I drove through the yard and down to where we'd seen the thing. When the headlights shone on the spot, there was nothing. Whatever it was gone. We drove around through the woods for a while, but we didn't find anything. Not a trace. The next morning, we went back to the spot in daylight, hoping to find some kind of tracks or evidence. Nothing. No prints, no marks, nothing to suggest anything had been there. To this day, my biggest regret is not pulling out my phone. It was right there. But when you're staring at something that shouldn't exist, your brain doesn't think about phones or proof or anything logical. You're just frozen, trying to make sense of what you're seeing. Even now, my friend and I still talk about that night. We'll go back and forth, wondering what it was. Some kind of animal, a creature, something else entirely. We'll probably never know. But whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. And I'll never forget the way it felt to stare at something that defied explanation.